want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference, both for, well, inviting me, but also for thinking about this event this year about commemorating Fanon, inviting us to go back once again and meet and sit and think seriously about him and his legacy. There have been a number of commemorations this year. This may be the closest to the actual day of his death, which was December 6th, and the commemoration that is going to, there may be more, but there is going to be one in Algeria itself next week on that date that is coming in a few days. And right now, there is an international philosophy forum in Venezuela that is sponsored by the Ministry of Culture of the Venezuelan government, and this year it was dedicated to Frantz Fanon. So today we talk about the North African Spring, and of course there are so many ways in which Fanon is relevant to understand today's political processes and social movements in the region. But I think it's also good to insist that at the same time his work left a number of unfinished tasks, that even without that spring there was enough of reasons for us to meet and think about him and his legacy. In a way, I want to talk today about Fanon and as a thinker of decolonization as an unfinished project. It was said this morning that maybe anti-colonialism, maybe it is true that decolonization begins with anti-colonialism. What it certainly is not true is that decolonization finishes with just independence. That formal political independence is not by any means the achievement of anything like decolonization, even if it is actually achieved, which of course we even question the extent to which independences were really even achieved in much of the third world. Decolonization, I think that it can be seen as a task and indeed as a fundamentally incomplete project that demands care and attention. And I think that in a way I would perhaps have a difference with the speaker in the previous panel who insisted on the centrality of socialism. Not that socialism is not important, but if I were to perhaps select one fundamental category in Fanon, like the first one comes to my mind to characterize his work, and not only Wretched of the Earth, but from Blasking White Mask, it would be something like decolonization. And indeed, I mean, I think coming directly from Césaire's discourse on colonialism, which is about colonialism and decolonization, and actually, in fact, Blasking White Mask begin with an epigraph from Césaire's discourse on colonialism. So I think that the clues in terms of the framework are provided there. And anything like a socialist politics, I think, is part of his view of decolonization. But also another part, the central part, is of course the issue of de-alienation, de-racialization, right? De-racialization of the self, de-racialization of society, and combating the structures that were naturalized in racist, racial colonial modernity. And again, that's why I think it's interesting that he begins in that time with an epigraph from Césaire, and not, let's say, an epigraph from Lenin. And it's interesting because when in places where socialism is sort of the main framework, you see, and we just saw this 2 days ago, the president of Bolivia, who is himself he's a light-skinned Bolivian, he's a socialist, and he is the vice president of President Evo Morales, who is an indigenous Bolivian. But by now it's clear that of the two, Álvaro García Linera is a very traditional socialist. And so we heard him opening this conference, and everything was about going back to Lenin. He actually said the greeting that he sent to Chavez from his as a vice president to the audience was, and I tell my brother that he is a Bolshevik willing to fight for the cause. So the imaginary is still is that one. Very interesting, and I don't think that it's not that is not important. It's not that we are renouncing certain moments and their relevance, But I think that Fanon was thinking with another sort of geographical, geopolitical coordinates. And so to understand those, we have to look at his entire work, and not only Wretched of the Earth and Us, and to the work of Césaire and other figures that preceded him. And in fact, I think that we can host Fanon as a quintessential thinker of decolonization as an unfinished project. And when I say like this, I say it in dialogue, sort of, or in contrast with Jürgen Habermas's effort to present modernity as an unfinished project, which I think that Fanon has a different idea about the main kind of project. That doesn't mean that modernity doesn't have anything at all to offer to that project, but that, again, the general framework and the horizon is sort of different. It begins from a different place, and I think it wants to achieve other things that are not only modernization and even equality and even liberty, that there are other elements that one doesn't typically find in postures that are grounded on modernity as the unfinished project. And when you operate, when you think about modernity as the unfinished project, as the task in front of us, you immediately are referred to, well, the European Enlightenment, right? You are referred to back to the French Revolution, to Europe as the home of that, where that conception of modernity was sort of cooked. Interestingly enough, when at the end of the Wretched of the Earth, Fanon says, let's leave this Europe alone, I think that in part it is this very Europe that has been trying to refrain in this other effort. And in a way, Fanon, the other points that he puts on the table for us is, well, the destruction of Europe. Rather than the Enlightenment, it would be the Second World War and the First World War, an important reference point. Another one being the wave of decolonization in the 20th century. Right? Also, to some extent, the Haitian Revolution, although he was clear that he did not want to be taken just as a person who is supposed to be interested about the Haitian Revolution and nothing more. Right? He didn't want to be reduced to only being interested to that or to the history of slavery, but that doesn't mean that he didn't think that both slavery and the Haitian Revolution were particularly important. And of course, the lived experience vécue of, as he puts it in chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Mask, of racialized subjects and subjects that are sort of dehumanized, and that humanization is conceived in a way as natural or as fixed as possible. And of course, the colonial world, and not only the metropolis, but the colonial world that is built in relationship, of course, with the metropolis, and the metropolis itself is dependent on that colonial world. So I think that the main pivots, the main columns of thinking about decolonization as an unfinished project, the main points of references are these, and that you can actually see them in his work in a very clear way. One could go further and see Fanon as engaging in a critical conversation with figures such as Descartes and Rousseau, René Descartes and Rousseau, the main figures of French thought and modern philosophy, and in a way, seeing him as providing different answers to some of the questions that in a way they share. And there are questions not only about political strategy or about economy, which is a tendency when we look at Fanon's work and work that is read as a sociology. And of course, there were sociological elements, but it was not only strictly speaking a sociology, it was actually sort of philosophical sociology. And it engaged many questions that have to do with ontology, philosophical anthropology, epistemology, method, politics and ethics. And in a way, you can even read, in a way, Césaire formally sort of inaugurated that probably with Discourse on Colonialism, which you can arguably read in conversation with René Descartes' Discourse on Method. You can see Discourse on Colonialism as a discourse on method for another age and for another project. Not for the age of secularism, not for the age of science necessarily. It's not anti-science, of course, and it's not necessarily anti-secularist, but the ground that is trying to prepare is the ground of a decolonized humanity, of deracialization. And you require quite a bit of other tools in order to ground, to have a proper understanding of reality, such that decolonization is possible. It's like, how does the world have to be in order for decolonization to be possible, if it is possible at all? What kind of subject does it need? What kind of methods, if at all, are necessary in order for us to unveil the path from coloniality to decolonization? Those are some of the fundamental questions that his work raises, and that's why I said at the beginning that in a way Fanon's text, his work, is pregnant with challenges that have been unmet, that is in the process of being worked out with North African Spring, or without. And of course, it's very important. We want to mobilize it, but we don't want to reduce it to that. So, this interest in ontology, this kind of questions, I think that came naturally to folks like Césaire and Fanon in part, because of the context, the moment that they were living in. This is something that Sylvia Wynter has articulated very well. It was in a way that context that propagated this sort of radical doubt about the promises of the West, and also about the very, even to some extent, capacities of the colonized subject, whose souls have been designed in a way in function of the colonial project itself. Right? That doubt that we can so easily find our path to liberation, that indeed it is not. And Blaskin, in a way, is like, I don't know, it's like going to Wonderland and it's Alice and Wonderland. It's like you take the ride, but it's not Wonderland. It's like the hell of coloniality for you to realize how intractable, how the difficulty of the condition, and how difficult it is indeed to try to find a way out. Right? That a historical moment that brought it to potent force to this consciousness. It was articulated in writing, and we received the legacy. And actually, when you teach Fanon, and those of you who have taught Blaskin White Mass, there are always a number of students who get deep into that roller coaster, and whose consciousness is deeply transformed. Sometimes I have to talk that text alongside other texts, which are very powerful, I think even more direct, with a more understandable language. And it turns to be, in a way, Blaskin White Mass that holds their consciousness, bring them into the text, and don't let them go until the end of and then they get completely transformed and traumatized. Still writing without any effort on behalf of the professor. So to some extent, living in that context, questions about the nature of but also the fallacy of racism, right? And also the observation of the good consciousness with which still many European intellectuals still regard colonialism, as still we are bringing civilization to them. Of course, that is what Césaire took aim at in this course on colonialism. That idea is still at that moment, Europe is coming down in ashes, where for the colonial subject is pretty obvious, like, well, like you're crying, you're seeing this, but isn't that exactly what you did with our countries and cultures? And so you see it like that, but when you see is them still defending the dignity of European civilization and justifying colonialism. And I think at that moment, everyone jumped out of the table and said, no, that cannot, we really have to rethink everything, because we cannot trust the same foundation. So that lack of trust, and I think that in a way, historically, you can relate it to 16th, 17th century, or 12th to 16th century, that moment, the sciences begin to emerge, the church, the tradition, the scriptures begin to lose value, to lose credibility. And then comes the moment when you say, well, we can no longer so much easily trust theology in the scriptures, but it's not like we have anything else or any foundation. What are we going to believe? And that's where thinkers like Descartes, Pascal, and other figures begin to say, well, we have to articulate the foundation for our new set of beliefs, for science, right? And then Descartes begins with the doubt, right? With the radical doubt. Let's begin with doubt. In a way, these Caribbean subjects were introduced to doubt by the very historical circumstances of seeing the decay of Europe, and seeing even when they look around their own context. This is how I take Blaskin White Mask, in a way, one of his main contributions, to see, well, that doubt, that ignorance, that problem is even at home, and is there. So it seems to pervade us. And when you hit that ground of complete uncertainty, is that then you can begin again to try to construct the basic pieces of what is the self. What is society? That is why at the end of Blaskin White Mass, what does he want? He says, not anything complicated, is, I want to build the world of the you. Build the world of the you. All of that analysis, all of that research ends with that potent affirmation, which means you have to figure out, well, what is the self, who is the you, and history, and of course he provides many clues throughout the text. But at the end, he ends clear with the foundations. And at the end, well, he elevates a prayer to his body. So even that is telling you, I am thinking the body differently. Something like the body, something like human consciousness, something like method. In the introduction, he says, I leave methods to the botanists and the mathematicians. And besides phylogeny and ontogeny, I would put sociogeny. So he was very clear. This is not just, again, a sociological description. This is also a treatise on method, a treatise on philosophical anthropology, but written in a very different way that we are used to. So invite us to read it with that complexity. On the other hand, he was, as was Césaire and other figures, reading French thinkers and philosophers that were engaged in Hegel and ontology, and there was Freud going around and so on. So in a way, they could not but begin to think also in relation to those figures. And of course, the footnotes, Bradsky, Weymouth, these texts are pregnant with footnotes to these figures. So it's clear that they are in a critical conversation. But you see, it's very different, particularly with Fanon. He's not simply, okay, this is the figure, if I put it in popular terms, this is the figure that is hot this time. This is the figure that if I quote this figure, I will be able to be recognized as an intellectual with others. So let me take that figure and let me apply that figure to the colonial world. In a way, he does almost exactly the opposite. He puts them, most of them, just to the footnotes. Just to the footnotes. And then he begins to have critical conversation with basically all of them. All of them. And it's not like he's rejecting it as a whole, but it's a very intense, and even with Sartre, he takes some elements and then he also criticizes. Even with Césaire, he also criticizes. He begins with this discourse on colonialism at the beginning, he's criticizing negritude in chapter 5. So you see, it's a very vivid mind, full with that intensity of critique, but in the service of not only critical destruction, but he's trying to formulate, is that path of questioning that in a way Descartes followed in a hypothetical way, but here is the colonized subject through an intense emotional process, right, involved in the path of doubt and critique, but also in that process finding the basic elements that would allow him to perceive perhaps the possibility of decolonization. So in this kind of project, I think that, as I said, is extremely relevant, and is extremely relevant for a number of areas that are here in a way in the US, beginning with, for example, US, African, and ethnic studies. Mentioning them here because I think that, well, these fields emerge out of activism, right? Emerge out of activism has a peculiar beginning in comparison to many other fields, with few exceptions. And I think ultimately, and Fanon, when you ask the folks who were crucial founding, sort of moving the university to create ethnic studies, they were reading Fanon quite a bit. They were actually reading Fanon. So I think that you can make the point that Fanon, the Caribbean, Martinique, and Algerian, is part of the main sources for something like US ethnic studies and African studies. And if so, I would like to pose that maybe these kind of crucial questions, or let's put it like this, which is problematic, but maybe I'm running out of time, so I need more things that take me to the nutshell. That perhaps he is to ethnic, you're talking amply on African studies and Asian American Latino studies, he is to these fields, like Descartes became to modern philosophy and to the modern European sciences. Right? That Césaire is also to these fields as Rousseau was to anthropology and ethnography, let's say. Right? That in a way, these fields that emerged because of activism, it was not only activism, there was much of intellectual ground behind this, and we still also have to engage seriously that kind of philosophical, theoretical ground of these areas, in context that I still see them as purely interdisciplinary collection of people that come from different areas, without any substance of its own. Then also, something like even Caribbean studies, and at Rutgers we are working, a group of us are working in a program in critical Caribbean studies, and the Caribbean Philosophical Association We have a methodology, as it were, that what we ask in the Caribbean Philosophical Association, I will finish with this point, I will only extend myself a minute and a half, if you know. That in a way part of the question for these areas, this is true, I think, certainly the Caribbean Philosophical Association, but I think it's true ultimately, or it should be true about ethnic studies, that the question is not so much how do you produce a student with a major for X, be prepared for X, Y, and Z. The ultimate question is what kind of conditions you create so that the intellectuals, the subjectivities that go through that program look more like intellectually someone like Fanon, someone like Du Bois, someone like Césaire, than a technocrat who knows a little bit of diversity and is employable in the marketplace. Right? How do you create the condition? How do you do it? How do you do it? I mean, so imagine the major. What kind of major would it be that will allow the students to go through the process of being formed and coming out in that way? Right? Attuned in that wavelength with the tools in order to do that, an impetus and correct attitude in order to do something like, right? It's a different thing that we are used to think when we think about designing a major or anything like that. In the Caribbean Philosophical Association, we do that in the conference itself, inviting activists, inviting artists, and inviting intellectuals from many different departments and areas, and putting questions of concern at the center, and not so much particular methodologies. And then finally, so we have US ethnic studies, critical Caribbean studies, Caribbean philosophy, but also I think that Fanon is very important for something like critical Latin American studies. Fanon was read in Latin America, the translation of Los Condenados de la Tierra was in 1963, before the one in the United States, right? Folks were reading him in Latin America, but it was mainly folks, it was read as an African continental thinker, in another continental revolution. Fanon the Martiniquean, the black intellectual from the Americas was not so much recognized, and it was read primarily by white, light-skinned mestizos who were revolutionaries, who were thinking about liberation. Now, Fanon is coming back to Latin America, but this is maybe the best representations that give you a sense. This is an indigenous publication. This is sort of a publication of a program on indigenous intercultural studies at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. And you see that they have the map of North America, Central America, and South America. Well, the part of North America, Mexico is part of. And then you cannot see here, I will circulate it, but you see Fanon's face over South America, accompanied on the side from Senghor, Césaire, Sylvia Winter, Cabral, and Louis Gordon. So, and this is an indigenous, again, primarily indigenous-oriented, Zapatista-oriented publication. So you see, this is not the traditional Latin American study from the US, and it's not even the traditional kind of Latin American study from the South either. This is coming from the revolutionary corners of the South, and Fanon is coming out with force as both Algerian and as Martinican, and as writer of The Pressure of the Earth, Braskin, and so many other texts. I think, for me, they are pushing the project of decolonization and considering it as incomplete. Thank you.